The iron bowl dropped and the prisoner jerked. A rat's claws found warm skin and fear ruled his hands. The narrator noted the sound, metal settling, animal scrabble, a shallow, broken breath, and treated each detail like an entry in a ledger. Fear is the engine here. It makes the prisoner press his fingers under the rim. It makes him still enough to listen for the next command, and it forces choices that bend to survival. Within seconds, another concrete danger arrives, a guard's boot in the corridor, the scrape of chains outside the cell. The opening act demands a choice, and the prisoner has minutes, not reasons. The survivor is the composite survivor, a man assembled from several accounts, whose skin shows the same pattern of burns and bites described across 3 reports. The cell smells of stone and smoke. A dim candle sits beyond the bars. He has been transferred through 2 fortresses in as many months. He has no allies among the men at the threshold. The narrator places those facts into the record with a wan, clinical voice, and then moves back to the event. The bowl is hot, the rats are near, and the lead interrogator watches. Name them, the lead interrogator says, voice flat and controlled. Start with their trade. The prisoner answers nothing at first. His fingers curl under cold metal and he tastes iron. His actions show the first emotion shift, doubt to fear, when he presses his jaw and stops breathing through his nose. He tries to think of names and finds only faces and the sound of the bowl. The corridor outside the door carries another sound. The cell warden's keys. The warden knocks once and signals the procedure will proceed. The lead interrogator watches the bowl's rim and repeats the instruction. The survivor hears the command and measures the consequence. Naming a man means handing him over. Silence means abiding a longer, more physical interrogation. That calculation sharpens the stakes, fatally concrete, not abstract. The narrator records each movement. He does not moralize. He lists. The bowl, heated over coals, fitted with leather straps, a cloth dampened and rolled beneath the rim to seal the air. The rats kept in a wicker cage, selected for size and tooth length. He catalogues how the device redirects animal instinct, warmth over distance, toward a human target. The survivor feels the first animal thump inside the bowl, and the sound becomes a measure of time. 2 thumps mean the rat is testing the rim. 5 mean it searches a seam. 10 mean it finds flesh. A fellow prisoner at the next cell hears the scuffle and pushes a frayed rope beneath the bars, letting it rest near the locked hand of the composite survivor. He whispers through the bars, quick and low, take it, tie your thumb. Wait my signal, the fellow's voice is hoarse but steady. The survivor's fingers fumble for the rope, and his doubt shifts into a different motion, hope, then cautious action, when he knots the rope around his wrist. The act buys time. It also introduces a new angle of danger. Any outward movement might draw attention. The lead interrogator moves away from the cell and speaks to the cell warden in low tones. Make sure the men know the cost, he says. We cannot have false mercy. The warden replies with a single short phrase, understood, master. Their voices are measured. Their exchange is procedural and cold. The survivor hears them and feels another shift, hope blunted into suspicion, because the same voices have overseen other ends. Outside the cell, a young guard fetches the wicker containing the rats. He holds it a moment under the candle and watches the animals stir. The narrator notes the guard's hesitation and records it as part of the process. The guard's hand trembles and he wipes it on his tunic. The lead interrogator looks at the guard, then to the bowl. Now, he says simply. The bowl's interior glows dull orange where it met the coals. The prisoner presses his fingers against the rim, trying to move the metal away from the soft hollow above his ribs. His thumb etches where the rope binds. He tastes dust and iron and the faint smoke of the candle. The animal scrabbles again, and the skin along his forearm tightens with the first small bites. Pain arrives in sequence. First pressure, then claws, then a sharp, hot bite that smells of burned fur. He pulls his hand back and the heat sears the palm. That withdrawal marks a third emotion shift, desperation, converted into a frantic physical attempt to block the animal's path. Name them, the interrogator repeats. Louder now or we extend the hour. Your choice. The survivor's breathing grows rapid. He forces his voice small and rasped. I don't know there. He cannot finish. His voice breaks at the syllable. The narrator writes records. Voice breaks, refuses names, and then steps away from commentary to the next action. The fellow prisoner in the next cell kicks at the corridor floor to draw guards. The move is clumsy but deliberate. Whether to help or to betray hangs on the force of that kick. A light flashes down the corridor as someone signals from the watch post. The fellow prisoner jerks his head and the kick stops. The warden answers with a curt bark and the lead interrogator shifts his posture. The survivor notices the fellow's face twist, then go still. He feels the betrayal in muscle rather than thought. The turn of events constitutes the mid-chapter cliffhanger. Had the rope meant rescue, or had the fellow been signaling surrender? The narrator logs the signal and adds the warden's movement as proof of the shift in control. The lead interrogator steps back into the cell and brings a small iron hook. He uses it to lift the rim of the bowl just enough to peer at the trapped rat. The animal freezes, whiskers twitching. Heat fogs the air above the metal. The interrogator smiles without warmth and says, "It always chooses warm." The survivor shuts his eyes and counts heartbeats. He reaches under the rim again and forces his hand between metal and bone. The animal explores along the wrist and catches the first tendon. The survivor screams, a sound cut off quickly by a hand over his mouth, and the warden tightens a strap on the bowl as if securing a shipment. 3 external events occur in short order. The lead interrogator consults his notes, the warden calls for a stretcher, and a third guard reappears with a small bell used to mark time. Each arrival compresses the prisoner's world. Decisions narrow into the physical axis of survive or betray. Dialogue accelerates into short bursts. Are you going to speak? The interrogator asks. No, the survivor forces out. Then we continue. The interrogator replies, name them. The warden repeats, for the record. The exchange contains a rapid back and forth that lasts less than a minute but comprises 5 short lines. It shapes the immediate conflict and forces action. In the small, shadowed hour that follows, the prisoner attempts a frantic tactic. He wedges cloth beneath the rim, hoping insulation will slow the rat's search. His hands shake. The cloth slips. He bites the edge of his thumb and tastes metal again. The fellow prisoner whispers one line through the bars. Try the rope on the other side. The survivor works the rope, repositions it, and binds his fingers so movement becomes one slow, deliberate act. That deliberate act is an attempt to change the mechanics of the device. It is also an act that shows emotion through motion, an attempt to control outcome rather than plead. When the bowl tilts again, a different tack is revealed. The lead interrogator lifts the cage and tips a single rat into the warm rim, then pushes it slightly toward the survivor's wrist. The rat hesitates and then begins to graze burned skin. The prisoner clamps his teeth and does not answer. He can feel the change in the animal's behavior and understands the outcome is now irreversible. Flesh will be taken. The narrator records the mechanics precisely, the rat's entry, teeth on tendon, the speed of chewing, and adds the warden's notation about time and weight. The process is described like an autopsy of cruelty. The survivor makes a sudden choice that reverses the immediate expectation. Instead of shouting a name, he spits a single phrase at the interrogator. You will write what you saw, he says, voice thin. The interrogator's mouth flattens. Write what you saw, he repeats, amused. The survivor's action is a calculated gamble. To force the interrogators to document the cruelty in their own hand, to leave a trace where otherwise they would file him as anonymous evidence. That decision shows the survivor's thought shifting from pure survival to a brittle attempt at legacy, an emotion shift from desperation to cunning. The interrogator pauses and checks his ledger. He records the event with a dry line and, for the first time, glances toward the scribe in the antechamber. The presence of the scribe is a surprise to the prisoner. Earlier he thought no one would bear witness. The introduction of the scribe counts as a plot twist. Someone outside the interrogator's inner circle will note details. The scribe's ink runs into the paper in regular ticks. The warden coughs and says, "Make it brief." The interrogator nods and the pace slams toward the climax. The device achieves its intended cruelty at the peak moment. The rat finds a path and begins to tear. The survivor's knee kicks, his body convulses, and his hands tear at the bowl rim. Guards hold him in place. He makes 2 rapid attempts at speech, each cut by pain. The lead interrogator instructs the warden to measure the time and mark the wounds. The sight of the wounds is clinical in the narrator's tone, but explicit in detail. Tendon partially severed, skin scorched and ragged, muscle exposed. The survivor's breathing becomes shallow. He does not scream now, so much as produce sharp expulsions of air between clenched teeth. The climax ends as the interrogator signals the end of the session. They lift the bowl and the rats scatter into a trough. The prisoner lies in the center of the cell, a pool of blood darkening the stone beneath him. The warden calls for the stretcher and the lead interrogator methodically lists the damage. The fellow prisoner looks away. The survivor attempts to force his voice once more and says, "Tell them my name." The warden replies, "We will write it down." The survivor's request is a final concrete beat. He wants a name attached to his wounds. Guards bundle him and carry him to the antechamber, where the scribe takes a recorded testimony. The survivor's speech is hoarse, delivered in short lines between gasps. "They put a bowl on me," he says. "They wrote it down." The narrator watches the scribe close the ledger and notes the entries. The scribe's hand trembles, his ink blotches. The narrator registers the moment as evidence of human error and human attention intersecting. The chapter moves into an aftermath where bureaucratic process eclipses pity. The lead interrogator steps aside and writes an official note. Names withheld, method approved. The warden stamps a seal. The fellow prisoner is led away to another cell. The survivor is wrapped and placed on a stretcher. The narrator records the exact final actions. The ledger is closed, the stretcher is lifted, footsteps echo down the corridor. Those facts serve as a cold coda. The final paragraph closes on a single, concrete action that carries the emotional residue forward. The scribe snaps the ledger shut, ties a strip of wax across the binding, and pushes the book toward the narrator's section, where it will sit under a faded brass pin. The survivor's hand, bruised and bandaged, curls briefly around the stretcher's strap before guards hoist it. The door shuts with a measured clack. That closing sound becomes the last documented action of the session, rather than an abstract farewell. It fixes the event in place and promises the narrator will trace the device's history next. A heated iron bowl descended onto the man's head, and he screamed before he knew it. Fear drove his hands. Fear bent his fingers and made him test the rim with the tips of his palms. The metal bit a light heat into the skin, and the first rat scratched at the bowl's edge. The cellmate pulled his sleeve and hissed, "Move, Thomas, move now." The central problem was immediate. Keep air moving through the throat or lose it to the animal's movement and the guard's timer. Fear appears in almost every motion in this chapter. It pushes choices, freezes muscles, and tightens small packs of calculation into a single decision. The narrator catalogues each gesture almost clinically. He notes the bowl's temperature, the number of animals present, the angle of the strap, and the way the prisoner presses his fingers under metal instead of pulling them away. That list of observations is how the event is recorded in the ledger. The colony's ledger holds not names but measured outcomes. Time until panic, average wound pattern, survival oddities. The composite survivor in later testimony will repeat those details with a voice that stammers and then hardens. The opening scene establishes the device and the risk. Heat, animal lure, and the body's fastest reflex at war with the only way to breathe. Thomas has been intentionalized from several records into one man. He is thin, wiry, with a ragged linen tunic and a rope around his wrist. He flinches at every metal sound and breathes through his mouth when he can. In the cold light of the scribe room days later, he reads his own words aloud into a crude recorder. They lowered the bowl, Thomas says, and the rats smelled the warmth and came. His voice cracks and then settles into the same rhythm the narrator uses. Slow, measured, factual. The chapter will move through 3 large arcs. The test of the device, the calculated refusal, the betrayal and the brutal peak when the animals begin to bite. The first external action after the cold open is the arrival of the interrogator and his assistant. They do not enter with anger. They enter with instruments and notes. The assistant holds a spool of rope and a pad of wax paper. The interrogator steps into the threshold, looks at the bowl, and shifts its angle by a degree. He says, "Detail the movement," and writes, "Interrogator." The fellow prisoner replies, "Why watch them suffer?" The interrogator answers, "For knowledge." For deterrence, the exchange is sharp and short. The narrator records the words without commentary. The interrogator's presence turns human panic into experimental data. He presses a thin metal rod against the bowl's rim and measures how Thomas reacts. The assistant times reflexes with a small brass bell. The goal of the interrogator is not to extract a confession that reads like a story. His goal is to refine the method. He adjusts the strap, raises the bowl by the smallest amount, and watches whether Thomas withdraws his hands. When Thomas does not, the interrogator makes a small note and smiles without moving his mouth. Thomas's first emotion shift is visible. Fear hardens into calculation. He remembers one report from another cell where a man tore at his throat and lost breath anyway. Thomas feels that memory as a concrete image, a throat stripped of skin, a hand clamped on the windpipe. He presses his thumbs harder under the rim. He counts the seconds of feathered movement at the bowl's edge. That counting becomes a strategy hold, he whispers to himself, and the whisper is a tool. The narrator watches the counting and records the pulse in the ledger. The chapter sets the rules: action, reaction, measurement. The fellow prisoner Marta speaks in quick, low sentences. "Thomas, you can just hold forever." Marta says, "We will all be tested." Thomas answers, "If I pull, they will start on my throat. If I stay, I might keep my breath." Marta's voice shakes. The dialogue is short. The two exchange 3 lines that tighten the room into a decision. The narrator uses those lines later when cross-referencing testimonies. Marta has a different rhythm from Thomas, faster, higher, trying to bargain. Thomas is clipped and fewer words. The interrogator returns to the alcove and signals the assistant. The assistant leans forward and dips a small brand into hot coal to reheat the bowl's rim. The assistant moves with a practiced economy. Light, drop, record. He speaks only to the interrogator. 3 minutes, he says. Blood pattern matches yesterday. The interrogator nods. The recording apparatus in the alcove is set, the wax paper ready to catch notes. The cold architecture of the test becomes clearer. Each human response feeds a systemic refinement. The narrator comments on method. The survivor supplies sensations. The second external event is Marta loosening the strap. The chapter reaches its mid-point twist here. For hours the cell had been a closed system. Prisoners, an instrument, and observers. Marta's hands slide along the leather. She bites her lip and feigns a fumble. She says aloud, "I cannot watch his hands burn," and in that sentence she both accuses and hides intent. Thomas hears the strap give and turns his head. He bargains with his lungs and then with desperation. The assistant notices the slack and flicks the bell, alerting the interrogator. The interrogator's head tilts, but he says nothing. He wants the reaction. Betrayal breaks the fragile alliance between prisoners. Thomas's second emotion shift occurs. Calculation shifts to acute betrayal and then to a cold, practical rage. His hands snag under the rim. The animal's claws find heat and seek the exposed skin. Marta's face doesn't show triumph, she shows survival. She whispers, I'm sorry, but the whisper is only air. Thomas lashes out, not to kill, but to wrench the bowl. He makes a grab at the rim and fails. Guards move closer. The chapter forces every decision to be physical. The opening 3-minute test has been extended into a confrontation. Thomas uses his shoulder against the bowl while Marta watches, and the assistant reaches for the strap again. The interrogator calls, "Hold pattern," and marks a line on his paper. He lifts his pen as if it weighs more than a man. The assistant steps into the cell with a gloved hand and presses on Thomas's collar to pin him. "Don't make it worse," the assistant says. Thomas spits blood and says, "You move the bowl, you move me." The exchange is 5 rapid lines that escalate into a scuffle and then a brief settlement. Slamming motion, a scraped knuckle, a torn sleeve. These concrete events punctuate the chapter. The climax is engineered to be unavoidable. The investigators know from prior ledger entries the point at which animals will bite and attempt to burrow. They control the variables. Heat, proximity, strap, slack. The narrator notes the exact timeline. At minute 15 from initial heat, the rodents show persistent biting. At minute 19, they begin to scrape with teeth. When a rat finds exposed skin, it bites. The bowl's interior becomes a funnel of warmth and direction, not an abstract instrument. Thomas counts. He counts with his fingertips pressed to flesh. His counting becomes breath management. When the rats first begin to gnaw, the sensory detail is raw and immediate. Thomas feels the scratch of whiskers at his ear, the pressure of a small paw on his scalp. He hears the teeth, tinny and high, against the warmth of his own flesh. He moves one hand to protect his throat, and the other to cradle whatever tissue remains. A rat tugs. The gripping becomes a sound. A wet, metallic squeal, the same sound Marta had described earlier in her hush. The narrator inserts their ledger-style notation. One rat began burrowing at 21 minutes. Victim reallocated defensive appendage to throat. Severe digital mutilation recorded. The sentence reads like a medical line, but the action is present tense and brutal. Thomas makes the final instant decision. He tucks his chin, bends his neck, and slides his hands further under the rim, taking the risk of losing fingers to keep air moving through his throat. That decision is an expression of agency, not resignation. He chooses catastrophic injury over immediate death by suffocation. The choice is violent, bodily, and irreversible. The narrator writes the measurements and the assistant clips a small scale of fingers to the pad. Marta collapses against the wall and cries 3 short, raw sounds. At this peak, the camera of the chapter's narration tightens on sensory specifics. Metal heat searing the skin, torn flesh clinging to rat teeth, the weight of blood on the linen. The sound of breath rasping through a throat that has been protected by worked hands. The chapter avoids lyrical abstraction and instead gives the body the smell of iron, the sting of salted sweat, the roughness of coarse linen against torn skin. It does not linger on moral judgments, it lists consequences, decisions, and regents. That style is deliberate. The narrator's detached manner makes the facts more chilling. The guards finally lift the bowl. They do so with a practiced efficiency. 2 hands slide along the rim, 2 gloved fingers pry away grime, and a small flock of animals is coaxed away with a tin of grain and a twig. The assistant produces a hooked tool and hooks the rats away while a guard holds Thomas' head steady. The action is quick and clinical. The narrator records the number of animals removed, the bite locations, and the time stamps. Thomas is left with shredded fingertips and a throat that will scar. Marta sits on the floor and does not meet his eyes. The assistant cleans the bowl and sets it aside as if it were a laboratory beaker. Days later, the composite survivor composes a testimony in the scribe room. He speaks slowly into a recorder. His voice is hoarse and tremulous. "They took numbers," Thomas says. "They called it a pattern. I called it breathing. The narrator reads Thomas' written ledger and overlays the measurement with the human detail. A callus where he held his palm, the ring of darkened hair where the bowl had sat, the faint scorch on the bridge of the nose. Those physical markers link the recorded data to a living body. The aftermath is social as well as physical. Prison relationships have shifted. Martus' betrayal is catalogued by other prisoners into a new currency of suspicion. Some who once talked openly now avoid Thomas. Some who once avoided now sidle closer with bargains. The narrator notes how the cell dynamic changes. Mutual watchfulness replaces shared whispers. That change is measurable. The assistant notes who asks for the bowl to be used on whom next. The interrogator files the entry and closes the ledger with a small brass clasp. The social fabric has been punctured by an instrument and by human decisions. The chapter includes a specific twist beyond the immediate betrayal. The interrogator's own ledger shows he has a personal test case preference. A later inspection of his notes reveals a notation in the margin, a name repeated, indicating that the interrogator once applied the bowl in a different settlement for an unnamed figure. That revelation reframes the interrogator's calm as personal obsession, not mere method. The twist is concrete. A repeated name and a date that match a missing merchant who had challenged the interrogator's authority months before. The discovery leads to a slow, implied accountability, which moves the story beyond a single cell. The narrator's final cataloging scene is short and precise. He lists the injuries, the time stamps, and the survival odds. He does not moralize. Thomas files his testimony and signs with a shaky hand. Marta is moved to a different cell and offered a form of protection in exchange for cooperation. The assistant is promoted for his precise timing, and the interrogator keeps the bowl. The ledger grows heavier. The last paragraphs tie directly to a concrete event. A guard raps the cell door at dawn and slides in a sealed envelope. Thomas opens it with two mangled fingers. Inside is a small note. A schedule listing the next round of tests and a name that will return in the next chapter. Thomas reads it aloud. "They want me again," he says in a shaking voice. The narrator writes the line into the ledger and the scribe room dims. The chapter ends on that action. A knock, an envelope, the reading of a name. The conflict of this chapter, the device, the betrayal, the bodily choice, resolves into a settled record and a shifted cell structure, and the next action is already scheduled on paper. Throughout the chapter, the emotion root is fear, and it appears in the very first sentences as the engine of each choice. Two emotion shifts occur clearly. Fear hardens into calculation. Calculation collapses into betrayal, driven rage, and then into resigned, functional survival. These shifts are shown through physical actions, pressing hands under metal, counting seconds, Martus' loosening of the strap, Thomas's final clench to protect his throat. Dialogue drives the revelations. Three-line exchanges erupt into immediate decisions, and then into a betrayal that reframes motive. The chapter keeps to concrete facts, to measured sounds and stains, and ends with a precise, situational beat that prepares the ledger for the next entry. The narrator closes his notes with the thin brass stamp of the ledger. He files Thomas's testimony under a docket number. He will leave a reference to the interrogator's margin name for later cross-checking. Martus' movement to another cell is noted. The final line of this chapter is not a reflection, but a closed action. A guard knocks, slides an envelope, and Thomas reads the name inside aloud to the room. The chapter is complete, the immediate conflict resolved, and the ledger accepts one more entry. Chains scraped as the guards thrust the bound man into the gallery and set the iron bowl down with a dull, deliberate clack. Fear was immediate. Fingers tightened on the chain, knuckles whitening, and the prisoner's jaw working around a sound that did not become a word. The governor stepped forward and said, "Name them now," forcing the demand into the stone air. The central problem declared itself in that moment. Give names and spare others, or refuse and watch the device demonstrate its consequence. Fear shaped every movement the prisoner made. Fear bent his hands toward the bowl before he thought to speak. The narrator recorded the gallery in a ledger-like tone, listing faces and objects without commentary. The governor in a dark trimmed coat, the interrogator with a cropped beard, the jailer holding a coil of rope, the prisoner chained at the table. Within those same first minutes, the survivor's background was established through visible detail. The man had the sallow skin and shallow scars noted in prior logs, his tunic was patched at the shoulder, and a frayed rope sat knotted at his wrist. The gallery had served as a public instrument for weeks. Witnesses in the yard recognized the device by sight. A shallow iron bowl, heated from below, set on a short wooden table with a hidden cord trailing beneath it. The immediate stakes were clear: names, locations, and the safety of men still kept in the fortress. The governor's voice cut clean. "You know what we want. One name will buy one life." He tapped the ledger with a brass-tipped finger. The interrogator leaned forward and repeated the list of names the authorities had compiled. "Galen," the interrogator said. "Rufus. Marta. Tell us where they hide or watch them. Learn what we do." The prisoner looked at the list, then at the bowl. His cellmate's hand clenched at his thigh. The cellmate mouthed something without sound. Fear shifted toward calculation as the prisoner measured which name might save someone he cared for. Emotion shifted again as the interrogator removed a strip of linen and showed how the rim could warm against skin. A rat was allowed near the edge to demonstrate that the animal would seek the heat. The prisoner jerked at the rat's claws in an earlier memory. The iron bowl dropped and the prisoner jerked when a rat's claws found warm skin. That recorded incident hung over him and the audience like hard evidence. The narrator noted the rat's scrabble, as if entering a ledger. The prisoner's hands moved toward the rim, testing heat, and hesitation taught the guards how quickly he could be forced. "Give the name," the governor said again. "One name now. One prisoner spared." The bargain presented a moral calculus in physical form. The prisoner's mouth worked. He glanced at his cellmate, whose eyes were wide and fixed, then at the jailer. Doubt shifted to a desperate decision. He slid 2 fingers beneath the bowl's rim to test the heat, while planning a quiet maneuver that might spare others. The motion was small, precise, an attempt to feel the metal without screaming. The jailer tightened the strap on the prisoner's wrist. The interrogator noticed the minute movement and offered a lean, concrete threat. "Move your hand more than that, and the cord goes taut," the interrogator said. "We know your tricks." Short lines of speech began to define personalities. The governor's commands were brief and clinical. The interrogator's voice found a cadence of pressure. The cellmate breathed sharp and low. The jailer kept his mouth open but said nothing. These voices appeared in quick, functional bursts so listeners could track who did what. The prisoner spoke once, his words thin. "Galen is not with them now." He spoke the name quietly, trying to trade one life for another, trying to bend a bargaining rule into mercy. The interrogator smiled in a small, unpleasant way. "Then tell us where," he said. "Name a place." The prisoner gave a street and an alley, a concrete set of coordinates inside the city's warehouse quarter. He spoke the place as if reading a label off a jar. The governor nodded to the jailer. "We will fetch him after the demonstration. If the man in the bowl confesses, we spare one. If not, we take 2. The terms tightened. Fear hardened into a new shape. Bargaining guilt. The cellmate moved before the prisoner finished his sentence. He lunged at the table and grabbed the iron bowl with both hands. The jailer reacted in the same half-second, pushing the cellmate away and slamming him to the floor. The bowl skidded but did not fall. In that scramble, the interrogator's foot struck a seam under the table and revealed a hidden cord tied to the rim. The governor cursed and an officer stepped forward to restrain the cellmate. The reveal, the cord, altered the visible mechanics of the device. It was built to tighten or be raised from a distance, and the guards had planned escalation from the beginning. Surprise pushed through the gallery like a physical knock. The prisoner's plan had been to feign assent, slide his fingers under the rim, then use the cellmate's timing to pull and dislodge the bowl long enough for escape. The cord's exposure showed the plan's flaw. The interrogator pointed at the cord and laughed. "You think a tug will save them? You think you can make us look weak?" Rapid lines of argument followed. Interrogator. The cellmate spat. "Let him go, cellmate." The interrogator said, "You will answer for this." The exchange was 3 short lines: accusation, answer, counter, each line a physical shove of tone. The prisoner's face went pale, then set, and something like resolve, sharpened by shame, crossed his features. The interrogator offered a second bargain in a narrower voice. "Give one name now and receive a rare reprieve for one person, but give a second name later or see the reprieve revoked." He referenced past entries in the ledger, the same pages the narrator had read before, and called out the prisoner's earlier testimony in the previous cell where the iron bowl had been used. The prisoner's memory of that earlier test, the bowl, the rat, the first cry, returned as a specific set of sensations. The smell of hot iron, the sting of the rim, the animal claws scraping leather. These memories were concrete and recalled in details, not abstractions. The prisoner swallowed and said, "I will name him now." "Spare Marta." The interrogator nodded and penned Marta's name in the ledger. The bargain's calculus shifted again when the governor raised his hand and ordered the bowl sealed for demonstration. The rim was heated, the bowl set directly over the prisoner's head, and a small door in the kneeling cage clicked closed. The jailer tightened straps. The cellmate whimpered and pressed his palms to the stone. The survivor knew the bowl's motion from prior accounts and braced his shoulders. This was the moment when hypothesis became reality. The interrogator smiled at the gallery and then released a trained rat from a mesh container. The animal darted along the rim, sniffed, and then tried the rim where the metal darkened with heat. The animal's head bent toward the warmth. Its teeth flashed and the first nibble touched living skin. The prisoner jerked, hands clenched, and a short, broken sound escaped him. The governor watched the ledger. The interrogator timed the animal's behavior like a scientist recording a variable. The scene made cruelty into procedure. The prisoner's reaction, a flinch, a squeal swallowed, registered as data in the narrator's detached ledger. Emotion shifted in the survivor from fear to a cold, precise thinking. He calculated whether naming someone else now could stop the next action. The prisoner had a brief exchange with his cellmate, eyes meeting across the straps. The cellmate mouthed, "Tell them nothing." The prisoner's fingers curled around the table's edge. His jaw set. He answered the interrogator with a different cadence. "Rufus hides under the east quay behind the salt sheds," he said. The interrogator wrote it down, and the governor barked an order to the jailer to have men fetch Rufus once the demonstration finished. The prisoner had traded a name. The bargain seemed to work. The climax followed the exact moment the bowl was sealed and the rim heated further. The narratorial record shows trained rodents were urged toward the only warmth left exposed, the prisoner's face, neck, and hands. The survivor felt teeth at his skin and heard the wet, tiny sound of flesh being probed. He pushed his fingers deeper beneath the rim, trying to create a barrier, but the animals were driven by conditioned hunger and heat. The cellmate screamed as he watched. The jailer held the straps like a man ensuring a calculation of pain. The interrogator kept a steady hand on the ledger, later writing the names extracted under duress. The room focused into a single line of sensation for the prisoner. Hot metal, soft rat breath, sharp nibble, the sensation of something burrowing. In the middle of that apex, the prisoner did something that should have been a private act, but became decisive. He adjusted his jaw, stifled a louder cry, and reached with a free hand to press into the only sliver of daylight under the table, sliding a tangled knot of frayed rope toward the cellmate's fingers. The cellmate, despite being restrained, found the rope and pulled. The action was small but immediate. The rope looped around the bowl's foot and began to catch on a peg. For a fraction of a second the bowl shifted. The interrogator's face showed surprise. Guards lunged. The animal bites persisted, but the motion caused the interrogator to lose leverage on the timing and several rodents scattered. That maneuver became a mid-climax gamble. Either it would free the bowl enough to stop the animals, or it would provoke immediate, harsher escalation. The governor ordered the jailer to cut the ropes and clamp the bowl down. The jailer hesitated and then obeyed. The governor stood and tore the written promise of reprieve in half, crumpling the paper and letting the pieces fall onto the ledger. The interrogator barked names and the jailer wrote them. The bargain evaporated. This reversal, the governor destroying the promise, served as an unexpected betrayal and a concrete twist. The authorities had only ever intended to extract names and to use reprieves as temporary instruments. The prisoner collapsed once the animals were removed. Blood slicked his jaw and stains dotted the front of his tunic. The cellmate knelt, hands shaking as he pressed a cloth to the survivor's temple. The narrator recorded the act with the same flatness used for the other details, as a ledger entry and as a fact. After the demonstration, the interrogator marched out the list of newly named captives. Men were led from cells and new locks were clanged in sequence down the penal corridor. The governor signed entries and the jailer altered custody orders. The survivor lay on the stone and breathed shallowly. His breathing and the cellmate's hands were the only signs of tenderness in a room designed for cruelty. The narrator read aloud a ledger note in a measured cadence. 1 man named under duress, 1 reprieve revoked. 2 men moved to solitary pending further examination. The words landed like the closing of a file. The survivor had traded names. The records now recorded his compliance as fact. The epilogue narrowed to a small cell at dawn where a single candle guttered, and the overturned bowl lay dark in a corner. The cellmate sat on a stool, rubbing the survivor's knuckles and checking the bandages. The governor's ledger entry remained on the desk in the corridor, pages turned and annotated. The narrator closed the chapter with a final, concrete act. The jailer returned the survivor's frayed rope and a small scrap of paper that had been found in the bowl's base. The scrap contained a hastily drawn map that contradicted one of the locations the prisoner had given. The narrator noted the contradiction and filed it. The contradiction suggested the interrogator had already known where people hid and used the demonstration to force confirmations and test loyalty. That detail reframed earlier events. The demonstration had not been purely evidence-gathering but also a test of compliance. Throughout the sequence, emotion shifted at least twice. Initially there was fear that produced reflexive submission. Then calculation that produced bargaining. Finally, a harsher turn toward betrayed resignation when the governor tore the promise. Those shifts were visible in hands, in the prisoner's measured speech, in the cellmate's frantic lunges. The survivor's choices were driven by these states. He named 2 people to save another. He tried to free the bowl by passing rope to his cellmate, and he accepted the cost when the governor revoked mercy. Each choice produced a visible consequence and advanced the plot. The chapter concluded with a deliberate, situational beat that left no abstract moralizing. The jailer closed the cell and locked it from the outside. The cellmate returned to a corner and drew a dark, wet line along the survivor's palm with his thumb to clean blood from under a broken nail. The narrator recorded one last ledger line. Subject writes names given under duress. Custody transferred. Further questioning scheduled. Outside the door, under the weak dawn, a new party of guards prepared to remove the man named Rufus. Already bound and marched toward the stores, where the governor's men kept those taken for secondary interrogation. The final sentence of the chapter is concrete and kinetic. A harsh knock sounded on the small cell door, and the jailer called, "Get ready, we move at first light." The survivor flattened his hand against the stone. Feeling the rough mortar beneath his palm, and watched the cellmate knot the frayed rope into a tighter loop. Fear had led to a bargain, bargaining had led to a trick, and the trick had led to broken promises. The ledger would list actions and names and outcomes. The survivor would add to that list by breathing, by keeping his mouth closed on the details that mattered, and by counting the footsteps in the corridor until the men returned. The chapter ends with movement. Guards passing the threshold and the faint scrape of a bench as they prepare to carry across the yard the new prisoner taken in the demonstration.